Hey, good morning. Welcome back to C4C Apologetics. I'm Danny, and today we're doing another interview. We just finished up with our Straight Outta Calvinism series, and now I've been wanting to interview this lady for quite a while. We first met her out at a Free Grace Alliance conference back in October of 2022. She did a workshop on reaching the youth. And whenever people talk about the youth, typically you're thinking of like Gen Z, but she was talking about a generation I've never even heard of before. And that's really what we want to focus our interview on today. And so I don't want to really get into details as far as that's concerned. I'm going to ask her some questions about that. But before we get into it, I do want to welcome Janine McNally. She is an author. She's an adjunct professor from the Grace School of Theology out of Houston, Texas. She's a curriculum writer. She's also a founder of the Grace for Kids ministry and working on her doctorates as we speak. That's a lot, Janine. How are you doing? Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. It really is. This last month or so has been crazy with my book release, and I just finished on Friday. I just finished the last in residence class before my dissertation.
Oh,
So
so what's your
dissertation,
dissert?
hoping to graduate next May so that hopefully I can focus on some of these other things I'm doing. Is so much. I've just
Oh,
got a lot.
I bet. What's your dissertation on? Do you know?
I have an idea. It's going to depend on whether my professor allows me to do it. I'm sort of leaning towards something to do with parenting,
Okay.
Generation Alpha, and how we can equip parents in today's day and age. So
Okay.
see what he says.
Well, excellent. Well, you sort of hit on a little bit on what this interview is about. This is going to be talking a little bit about Generation Alpha. But before we actually get into the questions, Janine, would you like to share anything about yourself, ministry, life, anything you'd like to share with the audience before we get started?
Oh goodness. Well, I'm an Aussie. Came across here in 2019, no, 1991. Gosh, that was last century. Good heavens, 1991. I was a high school teacher, math high school teacher, and I quit that and went to Bible college in Australia, a little college in Adelaide. I met, I don't know if we probably know Phil Congdon. He was my
Yep.
professor.
Uh-huh.
And once I'd finished my 3 years there, for some crazy reason, I wanted to do Hebrew, and the only place there was nowhere in Australia that did Hebrew at that
Mm.
point. So my the head of our school suggested I come over to Dallas Seminary.
Hmm.
So I sat down with Phil just before I was getting ready to leave, and I said, "All right, tell me about this Lordship salvation thing."
Mm.
It was not a big deal over there, or at least it wasn't defined and it wasn't really labeled. It was very much an American thing. So
Mm.
we sat down for probably about 45 minutes. I got my head straight, came over here, started my school, bumped into my husband in the library. He was visiting down in Dallas at the time. He was a student at the extension in Philadelphia, and
Hmm.
he had just had lunch with Zane Hodges, his friend, and came over and we got chatting about textual criticism
Oh,
in James chapter 2. It was very technical, but it fleshed out my view on grace theology, and he was like, "All right, she's clear. I'll marry her." Honestly, without that conversation with Phil and being able to define free grace, I don't know that he would have married me. Um, so we got married. We, long story short, finished. He finished his masters. I finished mine, and then
yeah.
we went and planted a church in New Jersey. From there, we went to a larger church in Pennsylvania, and then he retired. We went out to Colorado for 8 years, and that's when I became a kids director.
Hmm.
And then just last year, we moved to Florida, and this is supposed to be our retirement, but for some reason, I'm busier than I've ever been.
What part of Pennsylvania were you in?
We were in a very oh cultural culturally bubbled Quaker town. It is the second least transient county in the country. In other
Okay.
words, people are born there and they die there, and their grandkids do the same, and their great
Oh,
grand.
wow.
And across the road from the church is a cemetery with everybody's ancestors, and no one ever moves. So it was a interesting scenario to move into as a stranger.
And what was that town?
Quakertown.
You're kidding, because I actually had grandparents that live in Quakertown, right outside by Richland Town, same
Yeah.
area.
Oh, what's their last name?
Schmel.
Oh, yeah, German. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that's the same Quaker Town. They have the big old Q Mart out there.
Yep.
Oh,
Yep.
I miss the Q Mart. We need a Q Mart elsewhere.
I do not miss Quakertown. That was a difficult one for our family. I think they should always hire from within. Having someone come out from the outside,
Yeah.
it was tough.
We didn't live out there. My grandparents did. We would visit regularly. We grew up in Maryland. And so going to visit Quakertown, we just loved it. Do you remember the ice cream place called Greta's?
Gee, that rings a bell.
It was like right by the Lutheran church there.
I honestly, I've tried to forget as much of that area as I
I'm
could.
sorry.
That's
Memories.
okay.
Well, we're
Yeah.
not here to talk about Quakertown, Richland Town. That's okay, but that's a blast from my past, so I
Mhm.
appreciate that. So I want to jump right in right off the bat. So okay, so when you met your husband, you just for whatever reason y'all wanted to talk about James chapter 2 and do some exegesis and hermeneutics, right? So that was an
Well,
interesting
that's what
story.
he'd been talking with Zane Hodges about over lunch. So he came down to look for a resource, and I was the
Uh-huh.
resource person. So, and I was sitting at the desk studying hermeneutics at the time.
Mhm.
And so we got chatting about that first. And then when I found out what he needed, he wanted a cassette on a message that Zane had done on James 2. And I was like,
Right.
oh, James 2, I just finished studying that. And so we kind of got talking about all that stuff.
That's so awesome. Speaking of which, so I'm assuming you were involved in you adhered to free grace theology before that meeting.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what really drew you to free grace theology, and do you really believe one's theological system plays a role in ministering to the youth?
Oh, okay. So that's a good question. So I grew up in a very dysfunctional family, but in a
Mm,
decently sound, open brethren church.
okay.
But I think with all kids, I think they struggle with assurance. So I
Uh,
don't know about you, but when I was young, I used to quote, ask Jesus into my heart over and over and over again,
mm,
just to make sure I got
right.
it right.
Hmm.
And then I think it was probably when I was baptized around 11 or 12, it was an event that solidified my faith, and I
Mm,
could look back on that and say, "Oh, yes, I'm saved. I don't have to worry about that." So it kind of stemmed from that,
right.
and does it matter? That I think if you don't get it straight in the first place, my gosh, what a mess.
Mm,
I feel like with kids ministry and starting out doing what I'm doing, I'm trying to be a grace missionary
hmm.
in uh, all the churches across America with kids ministries. I want to have material that is free grace,
Okay.
but I don't want to necessarily alienate myself by fighting the wrong positions. I
Mm,
rather put it out there straight and hope that they adopt it. So what most kids
right.
ministry leaders are not well trained,
Mhm,
definitely not well trained biblically. And they are so busy that they really don't have time to check the materials
mhm,
theologically. I know when I started, I jumped in with a curriculum, and I did it was 30 something volumes, and each volume was
yep,
inches thick. And I didn't look through it all. I should have in
right.
retrospect, because I'll get to that in a second.
Hmm.
The gospel presentation was terrible. And what happened was the teachers, they pick up the leader's guide, and they basically just use the leader's guide. They read from it.
Right. Yeah.
So whatever is in there is what they adopt.
Hmm.
And so I spent my time trying to edit things to
Hmm.
make them free grace. Well, you don't have time. You're running like a banshee. It's the
Hmm.
craziest job on the planet, I think. So when I stepped out of that, I thought I want to create free grace resources,
Hmm.
and at least so that free grace churches can have them. But more importantly, I wanted to be able to make them well known enough so that other churches would adopt them and
Hmm.
accidentally read the free grace gospel, teach it
Yeah.
to the kids, and it would be clear. There is so many bad presentations of the gospel out there in children's ministry. And if this
Uh,
414 window, the most receptive time of a person's life between the ages of 4 and 14,
mhm.
when most people get saved, if that is true, which it is, what what is more important than having a clear gospel message at that point? Otherwise, we struggle with these kids that either have made a false profession of faith because they never really believed in the first place,
Right.
or
Mhm.
they lack assurance, and they struggle with that for however many years it is until they finally catch it.
Right. So is that what you mean when you mention you're a grace missionary, that you're trying to get this grace material out there?
Yes. Yeah, it's great to be talking to other free grace people, but
Hmm.
they've already got it.
Right.
My goal is for other people to, even if they don't get it, they will
Right.
use the material and they read it. They don't, they almost accept anything unless it sounds blatantly heretical. They will almost
Mm.
teach anything. So the gospel outline I use in all my materials,
Hmm.
they have no problem with that, but it doesn't include the bad stuff. So
Right.
they just teach the good stuff that
Right.
way.
No, I love what you said, that you're not out there trying to fight other like theologies, if you will. You're just trying to present the gospel from a biblical standpoint. And I like that because it makes me go back to the whole old adage that, so many people know what the church is against. They don't know what the church is for anymore. And so I
Yeah,
love that
when
aspect.
I first started looking at this, I actually contacted the I don't think he was the head of Lifeway, but he was one of the main people in the children's section of the Lifeway publishing company
Hmm.
who
Right.
published
Yep.
the curriculum we were using. And I said to him, why do you use Romans 10, 9, and 10 in everything? And I said, that's not a gospel verse.
Yeah.
And what happened, we were just doing this over email. He got very upset because for him, it was a good verse. For
Right.
me, it was terrible, and it was in everything. But I
Mhm.
realized after that that I made no progress with him
Mm.
theologically. He was already decided.
Yep.
And that's when I thought, you know what, it's better for me not to try and fight this because it will alienate my material.
Right.
So instead, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to take that negative stuff out, put all the positive stuff in, kind
Hmm.
of like when you're trying to realize, when you're talking about currency, um, fake versus real, you want to study the
Mm.
real really well, then you can
Yeah.
see things that are wrong.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that's what I do. I don't even
Yeah.
talk about free grace theology. I go to conferences and stuff,
Mhm.
and my materials out on tables, and I just say we use a really clear, free, simple gospel outline, and I
Right.
give the outline to them, and they're like, "Oh, I love that. That's great." And I said, "Well, this runs through
Yeah.
all my material," and it's like, "Yes, that's what I'm after."
You're right, and because we just recently did an outreach event for C4C Apologetics out in the community, and our whole purpose was to give out material to explain, the resurrection of Christ, why suffering, if God is good, stuff like that. And this guy came to our booth and he was like, "Oh, I'm getting tired of this Gen Z theology and this free grace movement." And he started doing this, and he said he was a pastor, and I was like, "Well, I'm a free grace guy. You want to talk?" And then he wanted to like get into an angry, hostile argument over free grace theology. And I was like, I'd love to talk to you, but my purpose today is not to argue theology. It's to reach out to the community, and tell them about Jesus. I was like, if you want to argue, we can do this, later. Here's my email, whatever the case is. But it's amazing that people get so a lot of times people will get angry when they hear free grace theology or free grace movement, if you will, and it sort of is divisive for
Yes.
whatever reason. And so I definitely understand what you're doing as far as you have a simple free gospel plan of salvation, especially if you're trying to get into some of these churches that really don't know lingo and stuff like that. It's an easy way to get in there and reach the kids, because that's what it's about. It's reaching the kids, not necessarily fighting for a theological system, which that is a good thing to do, but we need to reach the kids. And
Yeah, well,
so,
in this context, that's my goal, is to reach kids
yep,
in that
definitely.
in that window of time.
So speaking about kids, you're the founder of the Grace for Kids ministry. Can you elaborate a little bit what that is, and is that for parents? Is that for the youth? Is that for churches, ministry? Who can benefit from this, and where can we find out about it?
Sure. So when I stepped out, the first thing I did was I had a couple of very clear gospel tracks that I had created myself. So I put them on my website, and then I had some tools that I had edited during my ministry, and I put them on the website. And then I began to, one of the things we really wanted was, during Easter, Christmas, events like that, I wanted something to be able to give visitors or have kids sit and be able to do in church when there was no kids program. So I created activity books, but instead of just having dot to dot and colorings, I ran the gospel message through the
Mm.
entire book. So each page builds on the gospel message. So I made those, and then I moved on from that, and I thought I want to create something to sell. One of the biggest frustrations is trying to incorporate parents into the ministry. They drop their kids off. They don't want to get involved. So I started to create milestone celebrations. So baby dedication. When you give the children their first Bible, what is the Bible? How do you use it? Salvation, obviously, baptism and communion. Baptism's very popular. People want something to be able to teach the kids what baptism means. So I put good theology into the baptism, and then and graduating out of kids ministry, preparing to become a teenager. So I created these 6 celebrations, and at this point they are a packet for a children's pastor to use to teach a class with the kids and the parent, and every one of them has the gospel in it. And so you're teaching not only the children, but the parents, in case the parents aren't even saved. And my goal here is, if I can find a few minutes of time, is I'm going to turn them also into a resource for parents to be able to do at home with their children, and to begin to create more materials for parents. My first book was primarily written for children's directors, although it has a ton of information in there for parents and pastors, anybody that works with kids, teachers. My next one I'm planning on doing specifically for parents. Our oldest just had 2 twin alpha babies, Generation Alpha, 10 weeks old, and my favorite alphas. And she's going to actually help me write the book by asking questions that parents want the answers to, and then I'll answer them and she'll respond. So I want it to be a really practical book on raising these children with the gospel woven in there, because that's the key to raising them. So
definitely. So what is that website for Grace? Is it Grace for Kids?
So it's Grace, the number 4, and Kids with a Z. I couldn't get Kids with an S; it was already taken. So graceforkids.com or .org will work. JanineMcNally.com will go there. WhenYouSeeFireflies.com will go there. They're all kind of going to the same place.
Okay. Excellent. So we talked very briefly about Generation Alpha. Could you explain what a generation is? I know there's research studies and there's a lot of various opinions as far as what age ranges typically a generation falls under. And then could you explain what range is the Generation Alpha? So what is a generation? What age ranges typically fall within it? And then what is today's youngest generation?
Sure. So our generations are typically 15 years long. I always thought they were a bit more than that. So we know about boomers and busters, and then the millennials. We heard a lot about millennials. Well, the millennials are now the parents of Generation Alpha, so they're important in the conversation. And then Generation Z, there's, if you look it up, different places will give you slightly different times, but Z's are about the age of 14 to 29. And alphas are coming along. They are from 2010 through 2024. So the oldest alpha right now will be turning 13 this year. And next year will be the last year of Generation Alpha before the next generation begins.
Now, as far as the generations are concerned, so when I grew up, I guess I don't really want to claim it, but I think I'm a millennial, but but when we look at generations and these different labels, like I grew up before 9/11. I grew up before global war terrorism.
Correct,
I grew up when Prodigy was a thing in American Online and the dial-up internet. But my generation is different from especially these alphas, let alone the Generation Zs who grew up like knowing only war. Can you explain some differences in generations, like between millennials and me and Zs and alphas, and what role do those differences play for how the church ministers to them?
Well, you want me to tell you the whole book?
Exactly. And we'll get to it soon enough.
There it is. So the biggest difference is technology. This is the first generation ever to be born into technology. Prior to this, kids got their devices probably in their teens. They were introduced gradually to technology. They used it mostly probably for school to begin with. And now you'll see kids at the age of 2 with an iPad in their hands. So they have been born into it, literally. I was at a restaurant the other night with my husband, and off to the left was a table with a family, two young girls. And you know those restaurant menus, the kids menus that they hand out, which has the kids menu on one side and on the other side has colorings and activities.
Of course, because I always color on them.
There you go. And they usually give them some crayons. Well, the restaurant had given that, but that was pushed to the side, and both of the girls were on their iPads. That's Generation Alpha. And you know what? We can look at them and say, oh my gosh, they're technology addicts. And in my book, I say, well, yes, or they could be seen as experts. These kids are never going to know what a floppy disk is, or they won't send a fax, or even probably use a camera with film in it, but they will be in jobs to do with this artificial intelligence, which I'm only just starting to figure out. Robotics, remote medicine, 3D printing, which I still don't completely understand. They are going to be our experts in the future. So we have to learn to juggle this technology well. We can't, we're naive to think that we can get rid of it. It's not going away. So we have to learn to boundary it somehow. So in my book, I talk about how do we do that? What is good about it? How can we use it for good? How can the church employ technology in a way that's going to help this generation, since we know it's not going anywhere? It's here to stay.
Yeah, no, you make a good point. Like, I like seeing those memes where this is how my parents knew where I was as a kid, and they showed a bunch of bikes outside someone's house, and we had pagers. I had to be like a 15-year-old before I got my first pager or something like that. So, no,
That's
yeah,
that's where the title came for my book,
yeah,
Fireflies. So
yeah,
my
remember
oldest
that.
daughter actually came up with that and said, Mum, remember when we go out to play, we would say, when do we have to come in? And I said, when you see the fireflies. That's a signal that it's getting dark and you
Yep.
need to come in where it's safe. Nothing good happens at night. And
Mhm.
they didn't have technology in their pocket to tell them, or to buzz on their wrist,
Yep.
nor would that have probably stopped them. But these fireflies lit up the whole backyard, and it was unmistakable. You could see the lights everywhere. So
Yep.
she came up with that, and I thought, I like that. I think I'll work with that one. But yeah, they just didn't get technology until they were mid to late teens.
Yeah, definitely. So, talking about generations, now I know, like, from my understanding, millennials, they wanted questions answered. They had questions, deep questions that the time of the Bible says it, that settles it. While that's true, that wouldn't effectively help minister to a millennial. As far as Gen Zs, from talking to Caleb Reed on a previous interview, is they just want people to be real with them. They want realness. What do you see as far as Generation Alpha? Are there anything we can tell right now as far as what Generation Alpha is wanting from the church and the community?
So you were right in how you said, is there anything we can think they're going to be like? They are young
Yeah.
still, so we're
Mm-hmm.
guessing a lot of things. But what is showing up right now is they have a real empathy for people out there,
Mm.
overseas, not necessarily their next door neighbor, but people in general.
Okay.
And as a result of COVID, and social media, artificial engagement, they're desperate for meaningful relationships. They were blocked away from the world for 3 years, and you heard of Zoom fatigue. They got sick and tired of
Oh,
sitting
yeah.
on their laptops for school and communicating with people. They want, but I think more they need, meaningful relationships, face to face communication. They're not good because of technology. They're not good at communicating with real people. I was talking to my niece. She's not
Mm-hmm.
much younger than me, actually. She's only just a bit younger than I am.
Mm-hmm.
She's a pediatric speech therapist,
Mm-hmm.
and she was working with a young girl just recently who I guess had speech difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
She was there at the house for just a short time, and she saw that what was going on was she was just on the iPad all the time, and she said
Oh.
to the mom, get down on the floor and play with your child. And she said, I was finished with her in a couple months. I didn't need it. There was no need for me. All she needed was interaction with a person.
No.
Their babysitter is their device,
Yeah.
um, and their childcare, and that's bad for them. So they're not learning to interact. Plus, they move into a world of social media where you put your best face forward, and it's
Yeah.
probably not even you, and you interact artificially with other people who are doing the same thing, and that's just not real. So I think that's what's going to happen. I think
Okay.
I talk about in churches, the church has responded, especially kids ministry has responded by bringing in more and more technology.
Hmm.
We do need some, because if we put on a DVD or a CD, they'll roll their eyes, and they do need something to keep their attention because they're used to
Yeah.
so much out there. But more importantly, we need to go back to focusing on relationships, sitting down with them, talking with them, interacting. That's what they need.
So it generated a question in my mind, that I didn't think of before. Uh, how, how do we keep their interest if they grew up in technology? And so how do we keep their interest?
We love them.
Yeah.
So Hollywood, they wow the kids. We can't compete. There's nothing, any church, I don't care how big you are, they will never compete with Hollywood. So therefore, the best thing to do is not try to wow them, but to win them. Love
Mm.
them, connect with them, go to their soccer game, their school events, take them out for take your class out for ice cream, spend some time with them, get to know them. Barna research talks about kids who are in scenarios, and I don't have the quote in front of me, it's in my
Mhm.
book. Talk about kids who are having issues in dysfunctional families, and it says that research has shown that if they have one meaningful relationship with an adult in the church outside of their family,
Mhm.
that is what will help hold them steady.
Oh, wow.
Having a mentor, one of the things we did with our youngest, she's now 18, she really wanted a mentor.
Mhm.
So between her and myself and my husband, we looked at the church and said, who do you think you would like to spend more time with? And we went and approached them and said, would you be her mentor? So
Mhm.
during her years from probably 13 or 14 through now, she has had
Mhm.
two ladies that have inputted into her life outside of us. And if you were to ask her what was one of the best things about your teen years, she would say them.
Yeah.
Uh, One of them came to her graduation just the other day. The other one lives too far away now, but that's what they need, and that's what we can do to get past the wow. We still need to keep up with it some, but you can pull out a flannel board now, and they'll go, "What's that? Oh my, look, wow, that's amazing!" Or an overhead projector. Oh my gosh, look, it goes up on the wall. They don't know, that wows them.
Yeah.
Puppetry's coming back in kids ministry. Don't use it all the time, but every now and again, just to bring it in for some variety.
Yeah.
So
That's yeah, that's in flannel boards.
oh
I,
yeah.
I think we have some of those here around our church. Now,
Yep.
what you said about mentors outside of the nuclear family is very important because, like my daughter, she's 18. When we came back to Alabama to the church we're at now, she was 15 or 16, 15 or 16. And there's a couple young ladies that she took a liking to. One of them that we knew beforehand, before we actually left and came back, but they played a very pivotal role as far as her development as a young Christian lady, and still have a very profound influence on my daughter right now, even to this day. And so, very thankful for those spiritual mentors and just having people that are involved in discipleship. So,
Yeah.
at the FGA conference back in October of 2022, you had made a mention that there's a statistic that showed 83% of Christians trust Christ between ages of 4 and 14. Why do you believe that statistic drops as they get older?
That a good question.
Mhm.
I really think I was thinking about this the other day when I was looking at my brand new grandsons, at how dependent they are on other people for everything, for
Mhm.
life. If they had no adult there, they would die. They can't, they have to. And children are very dependent on other people. Therefore they trust them,
Mhm.
caretakers, whoever's looking after them. And I think as they get older, I talk about this in my book about preteens, their brains begin to develop. If you look at a scan between a preschooler and a preteen, they're very similar, because the preteens' brains all of a sudden go through a phase of change and growth where they go from concrete thinking to abstract thinking,
Mm.
and they're preparing to become adults. So they start to prune what they don't think
Mm,
they need. They
mhm.
called cognitive pruning. They know they can't fill their brains with everything, so they start to chop things
Right.
that they don't think are important. And I think that change where they start to question everything and they want answers, is when the suspicion comes. They stop just believing everything they hear, and I think that's got to do with why they become less receptive.
Mhm.
So we've got to catch them before then, or we need to answer their questions well so they don't prune God out of their lives. Um,
No.
and then, that whole teenage time, I believe we hold on to them with the whole idea of mentoring, that
Mm.
relationship again, where somebody other than mom and dad are building into their life and helping them stay with a foundation, as they go into their adult years.
Yeah. Discipleship, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I love that. Now, so this next one really ties a little bit into that, and I think you mentioned a little bit of it, or a bit of it in your book, in a culture of relativism.
Mhm.
How do you believe that we reestablish absolute truth for those? Like if they're doing this cognitive pruning
Yeah.
and they're trying to figure out what are they going to drop, and the culture, most of the culture is all relativistic. How do we reinforce absolute truth in their minds?
Yeah. It's difficult because they're surrounded by a very humanistic worldview that is aggressively teaching and modeling that worldview.
Hmm.
They're getting it in the school, in the media, everywhere, 24/7 is this atheism, pantheism, humanism, relativism. It's all in there. And they've got access now to all of the voices out there. There used to be mom and dad and the pastor and the church. Now they get on their phones and they can see anything they want.
Hmm.
Um, so how do we do that? That's one of the three things I talk about in my book. Is they think we're irrelevant, we're
Mm.
hypocritical, and therefore they don't believe anymore. And how do we reestablish that absolute truth? I talk about one thing we need to do is we need to answer their questions. So they've got really hard questions right now, and we tend to avoid them, especially in churches.
Mm.
Mary became Mark this week. How come she's now wearing, a suit and
Right.
tie, or he's wearing a dress? We don't answer those questions. So they get these questions in their mind, and then they go to the world, and well, that it might be wrong for somebody, but it's okay for them. What's right for them is right. Absolutely,
Right.
the relativism thing.
Mm.
Um, and Answers in Genesis, you've heard of them, obviously, your
Yeah.
apologetics. They're pretty good at doing this. They answer a lot of those questions. And I think it was them, it's in my book again. It talks about pressing them into a corner. So you get
Mm.
somebody, for example, who doesn't believe in the death penalty, and then somebody close to them is murdered,
Hmm.
and they're pressed into a corner where they've got to decide morally, what do I really believe?
Hmm.
And if you press them far enough, they have absolute in their mind. It is there. It's
Right.
just buried, or there's no such thing as right and wrong. Well, what about murder? Or what
Yeah.
about if your daughter was murdered? So you press them and press them until you get to the end of their relativism, and at the end is absolute truth, because there is right and wrong,
Hmm.
and they just don't want to accept that fact. And the problem is that this is happening when these kids are young and they're not prepared emotionally to handle these sorts of decisions. And Barna says there's a race for the souls of our children, and the
Mm.
first one there wins.
Yeah.
Valerie Bell wrote a book called Resilient, and it's about children's ministry. And she tells of a story where she was talking to two Awana missionaries from Africa,
Hmm.
and they were telling her, do you know what the Muslims are doing in Africa right now? They're building mosques and schools with the oil money from the Middle East. And any child can get a free education. They just have to attend the mosque. And then they get school for free. Well,
Mm.
they're not stupid. They know if we get them young, we
Yeah.
can keep them. No poor parent over there is going to say no to a free education. They put them in the school and therefore they get the mosque. They're recruiting for the future and they're starting very young. That's why
Mm.
we need to do the same thing. Absolute truth. It's a tough one. I talk about one thing I think we're doing wrong in the churches is we tell nice Bible stories.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously Bible stories are good. You know, how many times have you heard about Noah and the ark? But how many times have you heard them say, can you imagine what it would have been like being Noah and having the entire town laughing at you?
Mm-hmm.
And you're still building the ark and they're laughing. That sounds a little like bullying almost to me. Do you guys get bullied at school?
Yeah.
Taking the story and putting it into real life, and having it translate into application. I think we stop before that point for the most part. I haven't heard any curriculum go that far. Maybe Answers in Genesis does. I haven't looked at theirs, but we need to translate the Bible into real life, just like and indoctrinate them with a Christian worldview and do it aggressively and then model it ourselves like the world is doing with theirs.
I mean, that's part of homiletics anyways. Whenever we're up there preaching, you got to find, okay, you observe the passage. What does it mean to the original audience? And then how do I apply that principle to my life today? And we're just drawing the application to our lives. And yeah, I'm thankful to have a church here that our junior church teachers and kids ministry workers, they're very good at that. And we have some very bright kids, and well, they're all bright, but some of them are asking deep, profound questions in class that our teachers, thankfully, they're not afraid to answer. Like, we had a recent pastors panel session for one of our services, and one of the questions submitted was from like a 7-8-year-old girl, asked a very profound question, says, how will I not be sad in heaven if I know my loved ones aren't there?
Oh, wow.
And so they have deep questions at such a young age. A lot of times we're oblivious to it and we don't think about that, but
the
definitely
research says that most children's workers are not comfortable talking about those issues. They don't know whether it's their place to do it or whether it should be the parents, and they're not equipped with the information. So we need to either bring in experts to talk about them with the kids or train our teachers so that they can, because the parents are desperate and they want our help. They don't know how to answer the questions either. So where do we get the answers from?
And that's one thing, if I remember correctly, you actually spoke about at your workshop in October of 22 at the FGA conference, as far as equipping and training our junior church teachers and children's workers too, because like you said, a lot of times these people are just volunteers. They have full-time jobs and they just don't have the time to review the curriculum, like you said earlier, or even have the answers to a lot of these questions. So having sort of like a baseline of what are common questions, common answers, how to respond, what is a simplistic, consistent gospel message that all of our teachers can use as well. And so, definitely.
That's something I want to do. I want to create that as well, but it's on my list of what I want to do. I need help. I haven't got enough time to do everything. But yeah, just an answer, how do we answer transgenderism? How do we answer abortion? How do we answer just like a one-page cheat sheet that we can give to the teachers when it comes up, pull it out and be able to talk through what does the Bible say about these issues.
Definitely. And it's all coming from a biblical perspective. It's not trying to condition or brainwash or anybody. It's what does God's word actually say about it? And that's really what the difference is as far as that's concerned. But that would be huge. So we've already talked about this quite a lot, but in this book, when you see fireflies, you've already mentioned it. Can you rehash again, what is this book about and why did you write it?
Well, I wrote it to be a great grace missionary. Honestly, that was what came through when I was in when I was actively full-time staff. I did not have time to get that message in my materials. And I wanted, what's the point of working with these kids if we're not giving them a clear gospel message? What is the point? It doesn't make any sense. We're spinning our wheels, working really hard, and all we're doing is creating confusion. So that was why I wrote it. And there's a whole section in there about the gospel. What we did in my church, once I saw in the curriculum that we were using Romans 10:9 and 10 as a gospel verse, I walked into a class one day, and this was our preteen teacher. He was one of the guys who used to be an elder in our church, and he was reading from the curriculum in the leader's guide, and it said, if you believe in your heart that Jesus was raised from the dead and confess with your mouth, you will be saved. And he said, how many of you guys believe that Jesus died and rose again. And the kids put their hands up. And then he said, oh, yes, but how many of you have confessed him with your mouth? And I near stopped and fell on the floor. I'm like, what? And I looked at the guide. I went back to my office, looked at the guide, and sure enough, that was what was there.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, we can't do this. And so that's when I started. I was thinking, I can't change that curriculum. It's a massive job to rewrite a curriculum, nor do I think it would ever become well known enough for people to actually buy the thing. But I can tell my teachers, this is what we're going to do. So I had a meeting with my teachers and I said, and again, I didn't do it by fighting the bad stuff.
Right.
I did it by saying, you know what, these kids need consistency, the same message year after year after year. Mm-hmm. So from now on, from preschool all the way through preteen years, this is what we're going to tell them when the gospel message comes up. If you see it in the leader's guide, go to this, not the leader's guide. And I made posters. I put them in every classroom. I taught them a version of Larry Moyer's Bad News, Good News.
Okay, yeah.
Bad news, I'm a sinner, Romans 3:23. Bad news, the wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. Good news, Jesus died, Romans 5:8. All we have to do is believe, John 3:16. And I made a nice looking poster and I stuck it in every room. I got them to memorize the outline. We practiced it in pairs. And after the class, I'll never forget, one of my main teachers came up and she goes, oh my gosh, that was so good. I've messed it up. I've been blowing it with my kids all these years. I keep telling them to ask Jesus into their heart. This was great. And I thought, yes, it clicked for them. And I did it by saying, we're going to say the same thing so that, I heard that last year from Miss Mary. She said the same thing. And you're saying it again. And all they needed to do was rephrase the terminology for the ages that the kids were at. But we did the same thing to keep it consistent. So that was why I wrote the book. It was to try to get that in there. And while it's only maybe 1/8 of the content, it's in there at the end when, it's important. So
definitely. You mentioned Romans 10:9 and 10 a couple of times. I've actually got a couple videos on it, what it does not mean and what it does mean from my studies. And it's interesting, when people use Romans 10:9 and 10 as a plan of salvation, the Greek word for confess, from what I remember, is homologeo. And I always look at John chapter 12, verse 42, where he says, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess homologeo him. And so here we have scripture saying that there are these chiefs in the synagogue that believed on Christ, but they did not confess. And so I'd hold to the fact that confession is not required for justification. And so hold the fact that Romans 10:9 and 10 is the Jewish remnant in the end times is what that's talking about.
Yes, one of the papers I wrote for my doctoral class, the one before last, I wrote a 60-page paper on Romans 10:9 and 10. Why? Because honestly, it is the most popular verse in all of kids ministry. It's everywhere. And I see it and I'm like, oh my gosh, no. And I asked a friend of mine who I really respect, he's a fairly well-known kids ministry leader, and he used it. I said, why did you use that? Do you really think that a person has to say it to be saved?
Right.
And he, of course not. And I said, well, I walked into that classroom and that's what the teacher said. He said, I've never heard anybody interpret it that way. And I said, well, he did. I said, even if it did mean what it says, why would you use that one for children? You want the clearest possible verse. Why use a verse that has ambiguity in it? Even if you think it's a salvation verse, there's way better ones to use. But for some reason, the curriculum companies zero in on Romans 10:9 and 10 all the time. It's unbelievable.
I just look at the fact that, I know this isn't necessarily a theological interview, but I think everything involved is theological in and of itself. But a lot of the publishers, a lot of the universities, seminaries, all these other organizations, most of them are reformed in lordship. And so that's why a lot of this stuff is coming out, but it's fitting that. But I'm not trying to get involved in all that. But in your book, so you broke it down into 4 parts. You have halt, you have hear, then from there you have help and hope. Could you at least just very concisely break down what do you mean by those 4 sections and what can we understand inside of them?
Sure, no one has even asked me that question before. You were the
I try
first.
to find new questions
There you
for
go.
interviews.
Yeah, and I used H words. I don't know why I'm not big into alliteration, but I did. With the halt, it was stop playing outside and come in.
Okay.
Halt, stop. It's dark. The world is bad. Here, check the time. Look at the world these kids are growing up in. Technology and complete moral mess. We need to take note of the time that they're growing up in, this culture that they're growing in. Help. We need to change the plan according to the generation. There's over 2,400 different species of fireflies.
Wow. Did not know that.
And yeah, and these kids are unique and different, and we need to adjust our message to their specific needs. I mentioned Valerie Bell already. She made a statement in her book which really resounded with me. She said, I fear that the assumption of sameness or our cluelessness in the midst of huge cultural shifts may lead us to be unresponsive to the needs that these shifts present. In other words, as the culture is changing, we can't just assume that the programs we ran 10 years ago are still going to be successful today. We need to be watching, learning about these kids, understanding them, and making adjustments to reach them according to where they're at. And kids ministry directors don't have a lot of time to do that. That's why I stepped in to try and help them see the differences. And as I talk to kids directors, they're like, who is Alpha? Who are they? I'm like, they're the kids you're working with. And the last section was hope. Call them in. I talked there about the average lifespan of a firefly is only 2 months. So it's urgent. We need to get out there. That's the part where the gospel's in. We've got the answer. Let's call them in away from the darkness of the world and share the light of the gospel with them while we have time. The window is small when they're mostly receptive. So let's take advantage of doing that before they're out of that receptive window.
Yeah. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So as we're wrapping this up, and I appreciate all your answers and all your insight and your work as a grace missionary, for the cause of Christ and for the kids. What resources are available for people to utilize, for churches, for parents? Where can they find these things, and what can you offer them?
Sure. Well, my website is basically the central place. Everything is digital downloads, so you can just buy it, download it, use it as often as you want for as long as you want. My goal was never to make money. What I'm trying to do is make enough to sustain the cost of doing things and then be able to give stuff away. So some of my materials have gone to the Philippines and Burundi, and there's a church plant, for example, in Maryland that's being led by a Free Grace person. They don't have a big budget. I said, just look at the website, tell me what you want, and I'll ship it over to you. And being that it's digital makes it easy for me to do that, and then they can just copy it down. But most of the stuff are gospel resources, again, so that it's a clear gospel message, things you can give to kids at a fall festival or at Easter time. Gospel bookmarks, instead of just having a bookmark with pretty butterflies, it has the gospel outline, stuff like that. That's where I began, and I just finished writing a VBS program. People at FGA said that they wanted a VBS program. No one has bought it yet, but that's okay. No one knows it's even out there. So this year at FGA, we're offering childcare. That's a very bad word in children's ministry, because it's not really childcare. It's going to be a program which has the gospel woven through, and we're going to use my VBS program, and so they'll have games and crafts and songs and stuff, and they'll all be about the story of Nicodemus and how he was transformed. So those kinds of things are on there. My book is what I've just finished working on, and like I said before, I have milestone celebrations, baby dedication, when children are given their very first Bible, salvation, baptism, communion, and graduation from kids ministry. 6 different milestone celebrations to incorporate parents in with their children as you teach them, and try to take advantage of these milestones instead of just blowing them off. Make a big deal out of them. Use it as an opportunity to not only reach kids, but their families as well. And my goal is to turn them into devotional materials for parents to be able to use them at home with their kids. So I'm working as fast as I can work while juggling my doctorate and teaching at the
Ooh.
school. I just go 24/7. My husband just looks at me. He goes out and goes fishing. He's retired. So he goes fishing and I'm sitting at the pool typing to my laptop.
Oh man, oh man. Well, I appreciate all your work in the ministry and for the Grace for Kids ministry and just helping our churches like ours with your curriculum and just your clear presentation of the gospel. As we wrap this up, is there any final thoughts, parting words you'd like to share with those watching?
No, I'm just check out my my website. There's a free 25-page ebook on there about Generation Alpha. I wrote that before I did the book, which is a really brief overview of what we've talked about. Jam-packed. I'm a researcher, so it is jam-packed full of information. It's not fluff. And then you can grab my book, of course. That would be great. I honestly, I'm at this point, my audience is not huge, and that if I can write great material, but if no one knows about it, then it doesn't help. So
Right.
if people can talk about it, I have made some good connections with children's ministry pastors. It's funny because the people I'm connecting with, I have no idea what their gospel message is, but it's like, and some of them are female ordained pastors and
Okay.
Presbyterians and Catholics and all sorts of stuff. And it's like, it doesn't matter. Use this material with your kids and maybe they'll even get saved.
The gospel, yep.
Yeah, again, that grace missionary idea, I that's what I'm trying to do. Just get out there and make my materials fairly inexpensive to buy when I compare them to other kids companies. So yeah.
Yeah, curriculum is not cheap.
Nope, it is not.
Well, Janine, I appreciate you spending your time with us today. We're going to have links to everything we talked about in the descriptions of the video, to include the link to When You See Butterflies that me and my wife just received the other day. Or When You See Fireflies. I have butterflies on my mind. When I was in the desert, I worked with some Germans and they were teaching me German phrases. And one of the things they taught me was how to say beautiful butterfly. And I guess that memory just popped up in my head. But when you see fireflies, so I appreciate the personal little note that you leave in here as well. But we got Grace for Kids ministry link in there as well and everything else. So, and maybe I can get that 60-page Romans chapter 10 paper from you sometime as well. I'm going to shoot you an email just for my personal study and add it to my resources. Yeah, I remember when I did a James 2 paper when I was going through Liberty and I got a C because I didn't take a lordship approach to it. So, hey, it is what it is. So, thanks for your time and for everybody watching. Till next time, God bless.